I would say I would honestly say though on some of that, the fact that some of these viruses and malware that proliferate as much as they do, I think the average end user doesn't know as much about that as we give them credit for, especially in the monopoly things. It's whenever you start talking about the Microsoft monopoly suit, still to this day, it's, you know, the history I hear on all of that is the Pirates of Silicon Valley history, not the actual facts of what was going on. And in some cases, the truth is worse than the fiction in certain stages along that. And in other cases, it's 180 the other way. Anyways.
Well, I'm just saying that yes, it is a big company that has that, but it's not like that. That's helping them. You know, it's not like PR about viruses are really helping them. I mean, people don't know exactly what viruses are, but they know the word virus, and they know that it's a bad word. So they hear this virus, this no virus. I've talked to a few people about, you know...
Well, and the real thing is, the majority of viruses we call viruses, the ones that, like, everybody gets, they're not actually viruses, they're worms. Right. Very few people actually get a true virus. They get a worm, or a worm bundled with a Trojan or some type of malware or something else. That's... Anyways.
Well, for most people, it's one and the same. But yeah, you know, if I ask somebody who owns a Mac why they have that, they say because, you know, Macs can never get viruses.
Which is a lot of bullshit.
It's actually possible, and a few people actually are angry at me and say, no, they can never get viruses.
Well, yeah, well, no, that's the thing. And as much as I hate to admit it, Linux has this problem too, and that is, and that's the thing. Here's the thing. I actually think, from a security standpoint, regarding viruses, worms, and malware and all that stuff, Windows is better protected because the average end user is thinking, I'm going to get a virus, I'm going to get a virus, I'm going to get a virus. So they exercise common sense. People get on a Mac or a Linux box and they stop exercising common sense because they're operating under this false premise that they're immune. And anyone who's ever been in the IT industry not only knows that there are plenty of Unix and OS X viruses, but some of the Unix viruses make some Windows viruses look really tame in the degree of destruction they're capable of doing. So I'm almost thinking, when you get a true in the wild, like, equivalent of Blaster or Win32 for Linux or OS X, it will actually spread further unchecked in OS X. Linux, it's going to depend on the user groups. But in OS X, because the average OS X user is like what you're talking about. No, I don't get a virus. I don't need to exercise any common sense.
Then again, Linux distros and Windows tend to update for viruses a hell of a lot more than Mac does. Mac is often really late. Windows does it pretty soon, and so does Linux. But Mac, I've read a lot of stories about that. They take a long time to fix bugs, and yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my little beefs with Mac, actually, in that they've convinced everyone of this myth that they're immune. And so it's really funny when a major cross-platform security flaw comes out. It's like Linux's reaction to it is, okay, this needs to be fixed. You know, they tell everyone about it. Because Linux has never pretended to be perfect, as far as I know, ever. Which means when there's a problem, there's no shame in acknowledging it and going, this needs to be fixed. Mac, on the other hand...
But it does like to flaunt, but I would say less than Mac.
Yeah. Well, but what Linux is flaunting is we don't have all these problems that Windows has, and that, you know, the licensing shit and the other stuff, you know, we're open source or something. That's more what Linux is flaunting, not we're completely bug-free. We're more stable because we're Unix-like, but that's different than saying we're perfect. On the other hand, the reputation Apple's tried to convince the end user of is they're perfect. They don't make mistakes, nothing goes wrong. And that's still the reputation they want to convey in spite of stopping the Mac versus PC ads and Steve Jobs himself getting on stage recently saying, we're not perfect. I was laughing my ass off when he said that, to be quite honest. And it's just, I would prefer they arm their end users with common sense. Yeah, and you know, they don't pretend the problem doesn't exist. If they're going to take a while to patch it, and the argument I get out of Apple fanboys when I point this out is they need to vet it. And I understand that. You know, they need to make sure they're not going to break something with this patch. But it's kind of scary that Microsoft, who doesn't have their act together at all, repeatedly with every security crisis announced, beats OS X to patching it. It's like usually the order is the various Linux distros, Microsoft, then 6 months later Mac, which I think is scary to the end user. I don't think that's fair to the end user. I hate to be talking about Apple here on a Linux show. That's not really appropriate, but that's... Anyways. Either one of y'all have anything to say on that, or should we probably move on before we turn this into an Apple bad show?
The one thing I would say probably is if there ever did come a day where viruses and malware became prevalent, the first thing you would see is a standardized antivirus of some sort being included, or patches being forced.
Well, no,
they would find a way to get around it very quickly and to deal with the situation, I think.
Well, no, that's the thing. Well, and it's there actually are antivirus programs for Mac.
But they don't come pre-installed on those distros.
They don't come and there are for Linux too. And like I said, they don't come like you say, they don't come pre-installed in most distros. And that's the thing. It's the first thing anybody on a Windows box does is they're like, I need an antivirus. I need an antivirus. It's like, that's the thing that's been drilled into the end user's head when it comes to Windows. So they're looking for, you know, they get a good antivirus. I mean, AVG is great for Windows users. Off the top of your head, like, what's the best one you'd recommend for Linux right now?
ClamAV.
Okay. I mean, the Linux ones are largely free, and if you're running Wine, especially in Linux, you should install an antivirus, just because you're now susceptible to a whole
Or if you're on a Windows network.
Yeah, or if you're on a Windows network, because even though you can't necessarily get it, you can still become a carrier and infect your friends with stuff you share, which is not cool. Not cool at all. Don't infect your friends. But that's the thing. It's like, and I think even though it's not a problem yet, I would like to see the mentality in both OS X and Linux before it becomes a problem be, we should have antivirus on all systems. You know, it's rather than wait for a problem, let's be ready for it before we cross that market share threshold. And I don't really see what the problem would be with including that and having it in there, so we're ready for it. Or is there one?
I don't think there is a problem with pre-including it, but that's sort of acknowledging the idea that there are problems on the way. And like you were saying before, that the amount of Linux and Unix viruses in the wild are few and far between. So I don't know if maybe they just don't want to alarm the end users yet.
Well, I don't think it's alarming them. I would be willing to bet most people don't know all the packs that are in their Linux distro anyways.
Or it could be that they don't want to add any more bloat to the system. Because I know the Ubuntu disk, they've got it so close to capacity, they've actually had to start removing applications in order to make room for the new things they're adding.
Well, it's like, here's my general problem with that. And I got it pre-Blaster. I a lot of people told me I was nuts. They're like, take your tinfoil hat off, because I went around and said this. It was like, because in theory, Blaster was right, but they're like, yeah, in theory, every computer that's on any kind of network is susceptible to attack because it has an open port by virtue of being on the network. And I'm like, someday somebody. It's like I sound like a prophet now. I'm like, this is a potential security hole. All these ports need to have bi-directional control and everything else, and you need to be aware that this is a hole that's open by virtue of being on the network. It took Blaster for the industry to really take a threat like that seriously, and there's no reason that couldn't have been patched before it ever happened. Where stuff like that could have been very difficult to do, but it wasn't the way we chose to do things. I just have this sneaking suspicion that it's gonna take a mass virus in the wild for Unix and Linux to get that this should be the default. This is not Windows behavior. This is good common sense computer behavior. Same thing for the cell phones. Unfortunately, it's the security on the cell phones is ridiculously underdeveloped.
Well, actually, a lot of the distros, not necessarily needing to have an antivirus, a lot of them are including a very decent firewall out of the box, which does help alleviate a lot of that possible virus activity. Because, like you were saying, if the port is there, it's a problem. But if the firewall is blocking all of those ports, and it's a halfway decent firewall,
and analyzing for unusual activity over ports that have to stay open, because I can't count the number of things that try and sneak in over port 80. It's not even funny. Anyway,
well, port 80 should, yeah.
You kind of have to leave that open. It's kind of necessary. It's like it should be regulated. There should be a guard at that toll booth, but it kind of needs to be a flowable booth. Anyways, so that's on that. Okay, even though it's going to make us have slightly over an hour, we should probably address the video stuff. Or do y'all want to address that next week?
Doesn't matter to me.
Okay, because we addressed this once before, but we didn't really. We didn't go into it, and it went in real depth in a show that no one ever saw.